Thank you so much. Good morning. I hope that everybody here is feeling very lively, didn't go too large last night. It's a marathon, not a sprint, I understand. Before I do start, just want to know, put your hand up if you are an actual planner. Shit. Few people in the room over there. Not too many of those, I think we're going to be all right. Most of you will know I am not an actual planner. So anything that in the title has the word planning is always a little bit frightening because you think she's going to go so off-piste, what could she possibly have to talk about? But I greatly look forward to Urbanity every year, and look forward to it for one particular reason. It's the fact that the people who come together to hear all these disruptive ideas actually have very disobedient minds. So there is just a chance that something they hear in the room is going to become a reality, and I love that. I think the whole point of coming together as an industry to share ideas and to share information and insight is to make a difference. So let's hope today, in a whistle-stop tour of a few ideas that I've been gathering up from around the world, we can perhaps shake out some things that you might want to take away and try for yourselves. Now, if I actually get very carried away, I might transfer weight onto my left knee and then I will collapse behind the lectern. If I do that, I will be expecting a very good speaker rating, but you might just avert your eyes to allow me to stand up again. Before we start in earnest, we should probably just make sure that we have acknowledged the traditional owners of the land, sea and sky country all around Australia, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, who've had an enduring stewardship of our beautiful land. So, why are we here today? This is a little bit of an existential question, really, and I'm going to answer it in that way before I tell you what we're actually going to do for the next 25 minutes. Surely we actually exist to enjoy our life and to make a difference and perhaps leave the world just a little bit better than we found it for our children. Perhaps more equitable, more inclusive, more fun, maybe a little bit healthier. Maybe we help people to use resources just a little bit more efficiently. In essence, this is the basis of good planning with just a small p, not a capital P, for those people down the back of the room. It's all about making really good decisions today that's going to mean that tomorrow is just that little bit better. More pragmatically, though, what we're going to cover in this session is thinking about the future that we actually want and need. And you've heard some of the things that Stefan had to say this morning, and they'll carry through into this session too as common themes. I want to think about the pathway that we actually need to get ourselves there, and whether what we've always done is going to make a difference in the face of the challenges that we're actually experiencing. Then I want to think about a few places around the world and a few people who've been doing some things very differently. And I tried to pick locations that weren't so dissimilar to Australian cities that you'd be able to say, we could never do that here. And then finally, I want you to ask yourself, what next? What is expected of me when I leave this conference and go back to my everyday job? What should I be doing differently? The point of this is that cities are not museums. We have a tendency to think everything changes and nothing changes. The city is the static, and we as the individuals are the things that are fluid within it. But the reality is that a city is a living organism itself, just made up of millions of other living organisms that rattle around in it, creating energy every day. And each one of those little organisms has its own challenges and its problems, and when you sum that up, that's a lot of problems for a single city to be facing. And every day, in every single city around the world, all sorts of different things change. And some things that change we notice because they're big and dramatic, and they may be the result of a force that we can't control and didn't even know was going to happen. Or there may be tiny, tiny things that are imperceptible and we don't even notice them. So this is time for a tiny little bit of science. So not a lot of science today, but what is absolutely true is the extent and the pace of change that we're facing up to at the moment is getting faster and more exponential. So in a history lesson, there was a chap called Schumpeter. He was writing quite a long time ago, and he started to realize that with innovation and technological change in his own world and his own worldview, that it caused there to be major disruptions, and cities and businesses evolved. They went through great peaks where they did really well because of the innovation and change. Then things started to decay a little bit, and lo and behold, along would come another change. And for a while, everything was very unstable, and then people got used to it, and they started to build their capability. Things went really well. Then that started to decline, and things weren't going so well, and along would come another change, and so on. But what you can see in the diagram behind me is that those were quite flat waves for a really long time. Things didn't change in 1,000 years, and then they didn't change in 100 years. Then they didn't change in 50 years, in 30 years, in 25 years. Now they're changing out of sight in 5 years. And it's becoming harder and harder for us to predict what's going to happen. And we're being asked to think about more and more things happening simultaneously. our lives, our cities, our businesses, our professions are in a constant state of flux. And in that context, we're at a really pivotal moment in time, a very profound moment where we actually have more information, more insight at our fingertips, and we really know what to do with, quite literally. And we should be making better choices. And cities are not just the place where lots of these challenges happen, they're also the places where we find lots of bold solutions. So surely we should be engaging with as many people as possible to work out what's going wrong and to work out how we can make it better, and drive more conscious decision-making to get a faster change agenda to deal with all of these disruptions. And we need to start today, whilst we still have enough time to course correct. But what makes this exponential rate of change even more challenging is it isn't just one thing. Even if we just look at those global megatrends that we so often speak about, there's an accelerating rate of change that's profoundly disrupting things in a number of different sectors of our lives. And it's the convergence between all these different kinds of changes that are so difficult for us to predict. The interaction between them creates very complex and nuanced issues that we don't always understand. And sometimes they may be obvious what the solutions are, but we don't know how to enact them. And at other times, we simply don't know what will make a difference. Our world is becoming increasingly volatile. So ultimately, if we do what we've always done, we're going to get what we've always got. And the challenges that we face are becoming just so much more serious that we need to take a radically different approach. This is where the idea of radical planning comes in. So in a non-planning context, in a layman's way of thinking, if we use the two words radical to mean something that's not been done before, an extreme departure from the norm, something I could never have dreamt up, something a little bit disobedient, and we take the word planning to mean making good decisions about how to deploy our resources into the future, it feels like a little bit of an oxymoron. But this dude made a big difference to how we think about it. So this man's name's Friedman. I always think he has a very nice smile, and he's actually the father of the technical discipline of radical planning. So for those of you in the back of the room, I did bother to go and get my theory book out. I did bother to actually ask a real planner what was actually implied by radical planning in a technical sense. And they told me, luckily Urbis is full of real planners, so I've had a few people upstairs who were able to help me out. And what they told me was that Friedman's idea was that we ought to devolve planning to the people whose lives are actually impacted by it. We ought to actually get the community to be the ones who tell us what they need and what they want and what kind of differences need to be made. That we need processes to address small local changes and enormous global changes that are actually just and that subscribe to the principles of being community-based and having distributional justice and relational and procedural justice and fairness associated with them. I had to look up all those concepts. What it actually means is that the people whose lives are impacted by the decisions we make get to participate fairly in that process of change. Doesn't seem like such a big deal, really, but we rarely do it well. We push our planning, consultation, and engagement into points of high tension, rather than creating an ongoing dialogue with the community about what their real needs and their real appetite and desire for change is. So, after the end of the Second World War, there was quite a lot of reconstruction that was needed in European cities, and there were many large city authorities who started to understand, I think starting in London from the Skeffington report, the importance of engaging with actual end users. And this gave rise to a discipline where different actors and different participants and different plans were put in place to make change. So I thought we might actually start here and recognise that top-down and bottom-up processes are really important to radical planning thinking. It's about addressing the imbalance between the two of them. So it's not about saying no top-down planning, everyone is still going to have a job. It's actually about saying bottom-up planning and bottom-up processes can sometimes produce a better outcome, one that can be accelerated and transferred or transitioned across the rest of a city, even if it only starts in a very local way. And we're going to come back and talk a little bit about Haussmann and his reforms later. So one of the first thinking radically and having a practical application outcomes that we could point to happened in my own city, so back in London. And these three characters, of course, didn't actually live at the same time, so little bits of overlap between some of them. We just stitch this together, it's Photoshop. But it makes a point that there was a whole school of thought led by these very distinguished middle-aged white gentlemen, and the monocle is particularly attractive, who started to think about the problem of very industrialised cities with their poor health outcomes and their slum dwellings and the challenges of public health and also morality, but that wasn't top of their agenda. One of the things that they thought would be an interesting idea was garden city movement. So off they went, they ran a major experiment, it caught on, some of those principles have been applied around the world. And then we had Abercrombie at the end of the war looking at the future of London and saying, should it just grow out? How do we actually rebuild the capital? What does urban containment look like? Resulted in the Green Belt, another piece of planning legislation that is applied across the world. Radical thinking at the time, completely accepted practice now. We wouldn't even turn a hair if somebody proposed it. My point, the things that we think are so outrageous today, within a generation just become commonplace and common practice. So why should we limit our thinking by thinking the way that we always have done? A clear break with convention comes from my friend up here, young Gell, and I'm often told the story by my parents when they met him and his wife many years ago, that his wife was actually the one who came up with the idea of human-centered design. She was a psychologist, and she reflected on Jan's practice and said, you don't design for real people, you should challenge your own paradigm, and so he did. He understood that it was important to know what people really wanted and needed, and what kind of environments would help humans to thrive. So in many ways, he's championed the idea of bottom-up planning and thinking for at least the last 35 years. We also understand that it may need to involve people who are not traditionally involved in the process of planning and thinking about cities differently. So for example, Jane Jacobs, who was not a planner herself, a sociologist and a journalist, understood that it was important to actively cultivate a guerrilla movement. Anyone from local government here? Ooh, excellent, I can say what I like. No one was brave enough to own up. The point being, she tried to, I was going to say maybe they can't afford the ticket, but she tried this idea around Cheap Shot, that she would like to involve non-traditional participants in the processes. So the thing that was important to her was that you could be a tactical planner, you could be a guerrilla developer, you could just pop up and do things and try them and experiment, and if it worked, fantastic, scale them and make them policy, and if they don't work, get rid of them and move on, who cares? Another part of radical planning is about ensuring that the voice of those people who've been marginalised has been heard. And that doesn't necessarily mean by race or by gender, it can also be by age. The voice of a child, the voice of an older person, the voice of ethnic groups who perhaps don't have such a heritage of engaging in planning processes or thinking about change. And this is where the idea of distributional and procedural justice becomes very important. And then my friend here, you, who we're going to hear about a little bit later as well. He came from a background of farming village where he saw practical problems, and he went into a discipline where he found himself able to make radical solutions to the problems he's experienced when he was growing up. And he demonstrates another very important principle of radical planning, that change can happen from within. So far we've talked about a lot of fairly radical people in their time. And we've also thought about the idea that change is happening very fast and it's extremely confronting. And that planning is about making sure that in the future we have better well-being and better use of resources. So enhancing the future of our cities actually requires us to harness all the resources we have available to us to make different decisions. But that also requires us to know what kind of future we want and need. You might remember that each year I have a few lessons from a small planet to share with you, and that's how we're going to spend the balance of the time, looking at 10 different examples of places where a radical planning thought by a policy wonk or by a person from industry, someone from the community or a non-profit organisation has actually been translated into amazing practical outcomes that have really benefited people's lives in a city today, but also the lives of future generations in a neighbourhood or a city yet to come. And we're going to start, inevitably, in Paris. Who watched the Olympics this morning? Not very many people. Obviously, the hangover was too bad, or you don't care about swimming. Amazing swimming outcome if your surname is McEwen. So really great job. It was fantastic to be up at 4:35 to watch her. I think it's appropriate to start with Paris and to harken back to what happened there in the 1850s. So the Ile-de-France, we've seen so much beautiful footage of it over the last few weeks. It was actually a tangled mess of profound immorality and public health disaster waiting to happen. It was also a hotbed of revolutionaries, although people skip over that factor. And so Haussmann was charged by Napoleon in the Second Empire with getting rid of that part of Paris, subliminally because he wanted to get rid of a place that revolutionaries could hide and that the army couldn't get into very easily, but overtly because he felt that Paris should have the same grandeur as London, that it should have clean air and amazing parks, and people ought to feel that they had good public health and could promenade politely. So what did he do? He took 350,000 people and he moved them to the periphery of Paris and he dumped them there. And then he built fashionable new quarters and installed the middle class and made it look like the city it looks today. But all that did was actually compound social fragmentation and gave us 150 years to create enormous social polarization and the unequal distribution of resources. So fast forward to 2007, along comes Nicolas Sarkozy, a little bit worried about social unrest. And he decides that we need a new Grand Paris plan for a future metropolis that's going to be productive and equitable. I hear the whole égalité, liberté thing coming out in his speech when you actually look at it. And he decided he'd have a minister for Paris, a federal minister for Paris, because the city was so important to the nation. And the federal minister decided that the first thing he needed to do was to reunify this fractured city by making sure people could move not only from the outskirts to the centre, but also from many centres to each other. And the Paris Grand Express, the largest rail project ever undertaken in the world, was born out of that idea. And people laughed at them. They thought that Anne Hildegard and Nicolas Sarkozy were mad, that what was that going to do for Paris, and what a ridiculous waste of money. And here we are, 2030 it will be completed, and we're going to have another 68 stations. We're going to, for the first time, collect together all of those points of productivity, and we're also going to be able to allow those people who live in communities that have no access to resources to travel inexpensively to places where resources are going to be found. So this is a project about a grand vision for a very long-term plan of unifying territory, creating environmentally sustainable outcomes for the future of the city, so cleaner air, making sure that everybody has the same opportunity to access education and employment, social and cultural outcomes. Something that would be often very difficult for us to imagine doing here in Australia at such a grand scale. And taking the transport theme one step further, let's just think a little bit about London. So here we want to think about a big idea. So when the GLA was reconstituted, we got a new mayor back in 2000, one of the things that they wanted to do was to exceed the targets that had been set in the Kyoto Agreement. They felt that they were not aggressive enough and that they could do more. So they had a big sustainable transit push. And what they wanted to do was to have push and pull interventions, which said we're going to invest in the overground, the underground, Crossrail, and actually make sure that people are able to move around without a car. Then we're going to stop them from using their car. So we're going to introduce congestion charging, low emission zones, ultra low emission zones. We're going to make sure that people actually have EV charging stations, so if they must use a car, they can use an electronic vehicle. All of that is a bit of a top-down transformation, and it was a massive leap of faith at the time that's really paid a dividend for them now. But the bottom-up movement is just as interesting. So when we think about Boris Johnson, we often think about him as the Prime Minister, and, was he such a good one? I'm not sure. Certainly had a very bad haircut. But the thing that's interesting about him was that as the Mayor of London, he made some profound changes. The Boris Bikes, still called that, one of the most important interventions in increasing walkability and sustainable transit the city has seen. But the even more important one was how he worked with the local peak bodies to make sure that cycling was enabled across the whole transect of the city. So in the inner city, there was quite a lot of cycle infrastructure, and for short journeys, people who lived in Islington were just as likely to use his bike as to catch the tube. If we lived in the outer boroughs, not very cycle-friendly, not much infrastructure, also not so many tube points. So what they did was they, from a grassroots up perspective, invented a project called Mini Holland. And they picked 3 London boroughs, very different, Enfield, Waltham Forest and Kingston. And in there, they worked with local people to find out what the propensity to ride a bike was. And they realised that in some communities, people couldn't actually ride a bike, that migrant communities didn't necessarily know where to buy a bike, that they didn't necessarily understand the road rules, and they felt nervous about riding the bicycle. So not only did they install infrastructure, they also installed grassroots programmes to encourage people, and children particularly, to get on their bike. Do you remember I talked about you, the guy who grew up in a farming family? He understood the impact of flooding, went on to become a landscape architect of some note. And he invented the idea of sponge cities. So the sponge city model here, which has been largely adopted across some of the newer or faster growing Chinese cities, but also implemented in New York, which we'll see in a minute, and across other cities around the world, looks to understand how nature-based solutions can solve for natural problems. So the problem we're solving for here is sea level rise, inundation and flooding, but also actually urban heat island effect. What he proposed was that we increase the amount of spongy spaces, so for example, anything that can absorb water, and that we increasingly created green recreational assets that were also detention basins. So when they fill with water, they look like this one. When they drain away, they look like a normal park. And the access at the point at which they start the water draining away or naturally evaporating also has a cooling effect on the city. What's been really fascinating about this is what started as an experimental program has become policy. And so when we think, and something that we can actually monitor and implement. So Arup have a sponginess index. I love a good index, but I had never heard of something that actually measured a city's sponginess. At the moment, it only measures 8 cities. Out of those 8 cities, all global, Sydney comes last. But really interestingly, there are so many interventions that can happen at a very local neighbourhood level and equally dramatically at a whole of city level. Let's have a look at one of those. So this is New York. Who's been to New York recently and seen Hunters Point South and the Living Edge? You all need to get out more. So seriously, we need to have the urban developer in New York next year. Adam, I'll talk to you about that. Because there are some really interesting lessons we can learn from this. So they had a series of major events, weather events, Katrina, Ian, and another one, Elsa, I think maybe was the third one, that caused not only storm surge, but also inundation from rain and a lot of wind. And they realized the vulnerability of their community from the Hudson and the East River when the tides surged and when the rain did not soak away. And so the whole of the East River Edge and the Hudson River Edge have been remade in segments to ensure that they've become living edges, sponges, able to soak up storm surge. And when they're not needed as a sponge, they become a beautiful recreational amenity, providing very important green lungs to places in the city which are really quite dense. In New York's case, it's changed their sponginess from a mere 10%, i.e. most of their area aside from Central Park was impervious, to a sponginess factor of 30%, which will trend to 45. That is a massive change in a decade from a project that was just an experiment. Let's talk about food security in Singapore. So obviously Singapore is an island nation with very small amount of land and a very burgeoning population and economy. And one of their greatest vulnerabilities is food and water security. At the moment, only 1% of their land is used for agricultural production, and yet they've got a growing population becoming increasingly affluent and sophisticated in terms of their fresh food needs. So what they did, the Food Security Agency, was they said, okay, we need a dramatic solution to this. And they looked to a group of former farmers and an industry expert from a university and said, what should we do? And the answer was to create a vertical stacked food growing system that allowed for 4 crop yields every year. And not just to create that in land as a single use, but to actually intersperse it among commercial buildings. So I think it's called 1 Arden or some 51 Arden is actually a building that on one of its floors, it's got a food resource that produces 90 tons of harvestable food every month, all of which is used in the restaurants within that same building. So a really simple idea of thinking about how to grow higher yielding crops, overcome an issue of feeding a nation, making the carbon footprint of your food less and being ruthlessly efficient about how you use the land. But again, drawing on the expertise of a panel of farmers who were able to talk about what helped high nutritional value food to be grown freshly and quickly, reducing risk. This is one of my favourite examples. This is about feminisation of the city. I'm not overly a feminist, but I do believe that everybody should be able to use the city and feel safe. Madrid, of course, had a relatively bad reputation for being the most macho city in the world, and that it had been designed by men to be used by men, and that increasingly women actually had withdrawn from neighbourhood life in some parts of the city, and their ability to express their voice in planning processes was not well developed and it was not enshrined. So one of the things that they did, working back in about 2010, was say, we need to actually ensure that we enshrine the right of women and LGBTIQ+ communities to talk about what will give them safety in the public realm. And so they have an enormous range of different activities that they have put behind their urban regeneration and neighbourhood renewal projects. And some of them are absolutely gorgeous and incredibly easy to develop. They developed the actual process working with women to actually work out how women think about things, rather than just implying that the way that a man would think about it would be exactly the same. So, for example, they did exploratory walks so that the male planners and designers could hear how women felt at different stages of life from different ethnic backgrounds about different parts of the city. And they were blown away at the negativity that they heard. They had a female advisory panel so that every new building and every urban renewal zone that comes online has to be signed off by the advisory panel to say that women feel that it would be safe to walk around. So even things like the last mile between the office and the transport system has to be something that a woman of all ages and abilities would feel comfortable to use. They did safety audits for all of their projects, and they made remediations into the building codes and remediations into the planning system. They then created these safe spaces. I have no Spanish, so I'm not going to attempt to tell you what they're called in Spanish, but they were like community centres. And the idea was that this was a place where everybody could come to learn what the female experience of the city was. So it wasn't a space for women, it was a space where women came to share their experience with anybody who wanted to learn what they thought about the city or different aspects of policy and life in that city. And then after that, they created a whole toolkit that any city could use for free to help them think about how to ensure that there's gender parity about our experience of life in the cities that we belong to. Quick run through a couple of others. So housing is a human right. There isn't a country in the world except Finland who is not experiencing a housing crisis. So the interesting thing about Finland was, and it sounds a little bit like a joke, but there was a bishop, a doctor, a social scientist, and a politician who came together. And they were in a pub, and they actually, I'm not really sure what the bishop was doing in the pub, but apparently that's the story. And they felt that the level of homelessness and vulnerability, housing vulnerability, being experienced across the city was unacceptable. And they felt that surely if they marshalled all the resources, they could come up with a really dramatic plan that would eradicate homelessness. Now, it's a smallish population, but as a percentage, it was a large amount of people and growing, with a very significant over-representation of young people. So what they did was they did a massive housing audit of the city, and they identified all the under-occupied spaces, whether they were apartments or buildings that could be adaptively remediated, or whether they were small blocks of land that were sub-economic, but that a state-owned entity could easily put together some kind of housing solution on. And when they'd done that, they went out and crowdsourced the money to build apartments. And their target was 2,500 apartments in the first year. And they raised enough money for 3,500 apartments. And they bought, and they borrowed, and they rented, and they built. And the idea was that this project became enshrined in policy, a homes first policy, which says that all the other problems in society about underproductivity, social fragmentation, lifestyle disease are caused when people don't have stable housing, and that it is up to us to find the solution that will fit our city. Every year since 2011, they have delivered 7,000 new homes that they have funded themselves through the city's mechanisms. Sometimes the city tips in the land and they find the money. Sometimes the non-profit entity is able to support both. But the realization here was that people came together from across the city to solve a problem in their city because they thought it was important and because they thought they could. And a little bit in that vein, we can move to Milan. So Milan hosting the Winter Olympics 2026, very unwalkable city, very inclement, hostile streets in many parts of the city, lots of socially divisive issues that make it quite challenging for people to move around. So they decided to have an open squares movement. They found 31 different squares across the city, concentrated into an experimental zone first, worked with the citizens to say, if cars can't come through here, what would you do? Here's a small budget, you work it out. Tactical urbanism, let's see what works. And then what worked, they made policy and they scaled. So the long-term outcome for them is to get more people active and healthy outside of their homes and coming together to create social cohesion. In the short term, it was an awesome way to engage people in the changes happening in their city coming into the Olympic period. And this builds a little bit on the 11th Street Bridge in Washington. So here is a bridge that was a vehicular bridge being adaptively reused as a park, stretches between Capitol Hill and the Navy Yards and the Anacostia and Fairview neighbourhoods. Just to put that in context, if you live on the east bank of the river, you have 50% of children living in poverty and 16% of working-aged people unemployed. If you lived on the west bank, you would have 15% of children living in poverty and 5% unemployed. Massive social differences. Now, some of you will go, oh my God, when I tell you that they had 1,142 community meetings to create an equitable development plan and a design for the bridge. But the result has been an incredible change in social cohesion and an ability for people on both sides of the bridge to understand each other's story and figuratively and literally meet in the middle. Almost there. So, informal settlements, about 1 billion people live in informal settlements around the world. This one happens to be a favela or an informal settlement that I visited in Rio de Janeiro called Roxina. I don't speak Portuguese either, so sorry if I butchered that word. And here it's a project that's been led, a very disruptive project, led by MIT, who went in there and said, we can't help you to advocate for better services because we can't understand your settlement. We can't plan for it because we can't interrogate it. And so they used a 3D laser-based scanning device to literally fly and form every one of these streets into a model. And then they took the model into the community and they talked to the people about what they saw. And they asked them what they wanted to change, such that they could then build a better advocacy platform for the changes that they needed and make those changes faster. And we probably don't quite have time to talk about participatory budgeting, which is a good thing if you work in local government, but since there's no one here today, probably doesn't matter. The idea here was that Korea, Seoul in particular, had a lot of difficulty with apathy around the political process. People didn't know how to engage or why they would bother. So they invented the idea of a citizens' participatory budget process. They enshrined a sum of money, it's about $244 million US. They recruited 2,000 citizens, of whom 5% had to be from vulnerable and marginalised communities, and then they invited the whole community to propose projects that would change their neighbourhoods. And they used the Citizens Advisory Panel, if you like, to prioritise which projects would actually make the greatest change, to vote for them, and then to work out what the implementation pathway was. The spin-off of this has been a far greater participation in democratic processes in total. So we're coming to the end now, which is a jolly good job because I'm 30 seconds over. I think the point that I really want to leave you with is that the solutions we've always had are not going to get us where we need to go. And even if they do, they're just not going to get us there fast enough. That we have got so many creative people out there able to do new and different things, and we just don't tap into them. Slight tweaks to systems that have existed for generations are not going to make the difference that we need, and it's really time for radical intervention. It's actually time to plan our way out of a crisis. I think we need to understand that today's answers could be creating tomorrow's problems, and that if we don't collaborate across sectors, we're not going to get to these radical solutions to the challenges that are going to influence the life of our children. And if we're not prepared to think differently, then we're going to be part of the problem, not part of the solution. And whilst I recognise that this is not easy, it's no longer a choice. So in conclusion, radical planning could create a better future, but only if those big ideas are actually implemented. Talk is cheap. Who should have the vision? Who should have the power? Because all of us are going to have to live with the consequences. Thank you very much. Don't look whilst I hop to the seat.